There was a farmhouse on the edge of Plainfield, Wisconsin, isolated, quiet, surrounded by fields that stretched into gray winter horizons. From the outside, it looked like nothing more than the home of an aging bachelor who rarely left town, who smiled politely at the hardware store, who helped neighbors when they asked. He was known as odd, certainly. A little slow, perhaps. But harmless. That was what everyone believed. What they did not know, what no one would understand until a November evening in 1957 when a deputy sheriff pushed open that farmhouse door, was that inside those walls, something had been growing for decades. Not a sudden madness. Not an explosion of violence that appeared from nowhere. What had been growing there was far more terrifying than that. It was a pattern. Quiet, methodical, deeply human in its origins, and utterly horrifying in its conclusion. It was the story of what a human mind can become when certain conditions align, when loneliness calcifies into isolation, when grief transforms into obsession, when the boundary between love and possession dissolves entirely, and when no one, not a single person in the world, notices until it is far too late. His name was Edward Theodore Gein, and what investigators found inside his home that night would not only shock the nation, it would permanently alter the way the world understood horror, not the horror of monsters, but the horror of ordinary men. Because that is the most disturbing truth at the center of Ed Gein's story. He was not born looking like a predator. He was not visibly unhinged. He did not carry cruelty on his face. For most of his life, he was simply a quiet man on a quiet farm. And behind that quietness, something had already been decided long before anyone thought to look. If you find yourself drawn to understanding the hidden psychology behind the most disturbing criminal minds in history, not the sensationalism, but the real pattern beneath the surface, then you are in the right place. This channel, Black Pattern, exists to go deeper than the headlines, deeper than the crime scene, deeper than the courtroom. We explore the psychological architecture of human darkness. If this kind of dark psychological storytelling is what you're looking for, consider subscribing and leaving a comment below with your thoughts. It genuinely helps this work continue. Now, let us go back to the beginning. Because the story of Ed Gein does not start in that farmhouse. It starts decades earlier, in a family that was, in its own way, its own kind of trap. Edward Gein was born on August 27, 1906 in La Crosse County, Wisconsin. He was the second son of George Gein and Augusta Wilhelmina Gein, née Lerche. On paper, it was an ordinary rural family. A father who worked various jobs, struggled with alcohol, drifted through failure. A mother who ran the household, read the Bible aloud, and believed with fierce absolute conviction that the world outside their home was corrupt, sinful, and dangerous. Augusta Gein was the gravitational center of Ed's entire psychological world. She was, by nearly every account of those who knew the family and by every analysis of Ed's later life, a profoundly dominating woman. She was deeply religious in a way that was less about faith and more about control. She interpreted scripture as a weapon. She used it to wall her children away from the outside world, from other children, from any influence she had not personally approved. She believed women, all women, were instruments of corruption. She warned her boys constantly that female sexuality was sinful, that the world beyond their property was filled with moral disease, and that only through obedience to God and to her could they hope to survive. George Gein, Ed's father, was largely absent in every sense that mattered. He was present in the household but exerted almost no countervailing force. He drank. He failed at businesses. He was described as weak, passive, and unable to challenge Augusta's control. Ed would later describe his father in ways that suggested contempt mixed with pity, a figure who occupied space without meaning anything. Augusta made sure of that. She consistently undermined George in front of the children, reinforcing the message that men who did not submit to her version of righteousness were worthless. What this created in the Gein home was an environment that psychologists and biographers have since described as one of the most psychologically severe domestic conditions imaginable for a developing child. Augusta was not physically abusive in the ways that tend to leave visible marks. Her abuse was architectural, She built the interior of Ed's mind for him, room by room, without windows, without exits, without any light she had not personally chosen. Ed and his older brother, Henry, were not permitted to have friends. They were educated at home and later allowed limited attendance at school, but any social development was actively discouraged and punished. Augusta feared that outside friendships would expose her sons to sin. What this meant in practice was that Ed Gein grew up in a world that contained essentially two people, his mother and himself. His father barely registered. His brother Henry would become, over time, a source of psychological tension. But for the formative years of Ed's childhood and adolescence, the world was Augusta, and Ed loved her. This is perhaps the most important and most disturbing psychological fact in the entire story. He did not merely fear Augusta, though fear was certainly present. He adored her. He worshipped her. She was everything. His authority, his companionship, his emotional sustenance, his entire frame of reference for what love meant. He had no other model, no peer friendships, no outside relationships that might have offered him a different reflection of what human connection could look like. What that produced was a dependency that was absolute. And like all absolute dependencies, it contained within it the seed of catastrophic psychological consequence. Because Augusta did not simply love Ed in return, she loved him conditionally and strategically. She used her affection as a lever. She alternated warmth with withdrawal, praise with humiliation, closeness with judgment. She told him explicitly that he was weak, that he was likely to end up like his father, a failure, a sinner, unless he remained in her orbit. She communicated in ways both direct and indirect that the world outside their farm was unsafe, that he could not survive without her, and that his own impulses, any impulse that moved toward independence, toward other people, toward sexuality, toward self-determination, were dangerous and wrong. At school, the rare times he attended, Ed was remembered by classmates as peculiar, withdrawn. He reportedly laughed at inappropriate moments, at things that others did not find funny, in ways that seemed disconnected from the social context around him. He had difficulty making eye contact. He flinched from physical contact. He was not aggressive as a child, not violent, not visibly disturbed in the ways we sometimes retrospectively imagine must have been obvious. He was simply elsewhere, as though part of him had already retreated to an interior space that no one else could access. That interior space was being furnished, quietly and continuously, by the world Augusta had built for him. There is a detail from Ed's childhood that is difficult to assess precisely because documented accounts vary. But what seems consistently reported is that Augusta read aloud to her sons from the Bible with particular emphasis on the Old Testament. Passages about death, divine punishment, the corruption of flesh, the vileness of the human body and sin. She seemed drawn to imagery of blood, sacrifice, and moral annihilation. Whether this was deliberate psychological engineering or simply her genuine theological worldview is impossible to determine with certainty. But its effect, as revealed by Ed's later behavior, was to create in his developing mind a deeply strange relationship between the body, death, and what might be described as a kind of sacred significance. The Gein family moved to a farm near Plainfield, Wisconsin, in 1914, when Ed was 7 years old. Augusta had purchased the property specifically to distance her family from what she perceived as the corrupting influences of town life. The farm was remote, deliberately so. This was not coincidence, it was strategy. She wanted isolation, and she achieved it completely. For the next 4 decades, that farm would be the world, and Ed Gein would learn to live inside it with the particular intensity of someone who has nowhere else to go. The years passed. Ed's father, George, died in 1940 from heart failure complicated by years of alcoholism. Ed was 33 years old. By nearly all accounts, he felt almost nothing at his father's death. George had never been a real presence in his life. What his death changed was that Augusta was now the sole center of Ed's emotional universe, without even the ghost of a counterbalancing figure. Then something happened that would constitute what psychologists might describe as the single most destabilizing event of Ed Gein's life. the event around which everything else in his story orbits like debris around a black hole. Henry Gein, Ed's older brother, died in 1944. The official cause was listed as heart disease, though the circumstances were unusual enough that questions have lingered. Henry had reportedly begun, in the years before his death, to say things about Augusta. Critical things, challenging things. He had been seen arguing with Ed, trying to point out what their mother's influence had done to them both. He had, in some sense, begun to see the architecture of the trap they were living in. And then he was gone. Ed was the one who reported Henry missing after a brush fire on their property. He was also the one who led authorities directly to Henry's body in an area that had not yet been touched by the fire. There was bruising on Henry's head. The death was ruled accidental. It was not investigated further. We cannot know, with any evidentiary certainty, what happened to Henry Gein. But what we can observe is that Ed never spoke of his brother's death with grief, and that Henry's disappearance removed the last person who had begun to question the world Augusta had built, the last voice that might conceivably have served as a disruption to the pattern forming inside Ed's mind. 1 year later, in December of 1945, Augusta Gein suffered a stroke. She died shortly after. And with her death, Edward Gein's psychological world did not simply lose its center. It collapsed entirely. He was 39 years old. He had never formed a meaningful relationship with another human being. He had never lived independently. He had never developed an identity separate from his role as Augusta's son. Every emotional need he had, for connection, for approval, for love, for meaning, had been directed exclusively toward one person for nearly 4 decades. And that person was now gone. What followed in the years after Augusta's death is documented in fragments, pieced together from Ed's later confessions, from neighbors' recollections, and from the evidence that investigators would eventually gather. But what those fragments reveal, taken together, is the portrait of a mind in a specific kind of freefall, not violent at first, not criminal in any way that was visible, but deeply and increasingly untethered from anything that might be called ordinary reality. Ed Gein was left alone on the farm. He boarded up most of the house. Specifically, he sealed off the rooms that had been Augusta's, her bedroom, the upstairs parlor, the spaces she had occupied. Those rooms were left exactly as she had left them, preserved, untouched, as if time inside them could be prevented from moving. As if, in some part of him, he believed that sealing those rooms was a way of protecting what remained of her. He lived in the kitchen and a few small rooms. He took occasional odd jobs in town. He was known in Plainfield as eccentric but essentially harmless. People pitied him, perhaps. He was a bachelor, clearly strange, clearly lonely. But in a small rural community in post-war America, odd bachelors were not unusual, and Ed did not give people reason to look more closely. But he was reading, obsessively, compulsively, and in a direction that revealed everything about where his grief had taken him. He read about anatomy. He read about the Nazi experiments, accounts of which had entered public knowledge after the war. He read about headhunting cultures, about practices of preservation, about what the body becomes after death and what can be done with it. He read true crime stories. He read pulp adventure magazines, and he became fascinated, in a way that was becoming something beyond fascination, with what lay beneath the surface of the human form. Some accounts suggest that Ed began visiting the local graveyard during this period. That he would read the obituaries in the local newspaper and take note of which graves were newly dug. That he would visit them at night and begin to exhume bodies, or portions of bodies, bringing them back to the farm. What he was doing, investigators would later theorize, was attempting to reconstruct his mother. Not metaphorically, literally. He was drawn, with an obsessive compulsion he later described in confessions as something he experienced almost like a trance, to the idea of creating a woman, a suit of flesh, that he could inhabit or possess. Some accounts suggest he harbored fantasies about transformation, about becoming a woman, specifically about becoming his mother, as though the annihilation of his identity through Augusta's control had left him with no other framework for what being a person might feel like. This is where the documented psychological material becomes deeply complex, and where caution is warranted in avoiding oversimplification. Ed Gein was later assessed by multiple mental health professionals. He was found to be psychotic. He was found to have been experiencing a disconnection from reality that made him legally insane at the time of the events under investigation. The specific nature of his psychological condition has been discussed and debated, but what the assessments consistently reveal is not a man who was calculating or strategically sadistic in the way of many serial killers. He was, in a clinical and tragic sense, profoundly mentally ill. His mind shaped by decades of isolation and emotional distortion into something that had lost its grip on the ordinary boundaries between self and other, between living and dead, between love and possession. And still, he had lived among people for years, had interacted with them, had been seen and not seen. The pattern was there, but no one had learned to read it. At some point in the early 1950s, the exhumations are believed to have given way to something more active. By his own later confession, Ed Gein killed at least 2 women. The first was Mary Hogan, a tavern owner who disappeared in December 1954. The second was Bernice Worden, a hardware store owner whose disappearance triggered the investigation that would finally break the story open. On the evening of November 16, 1957, Bernice Worden's son Frank, a deputy sheriff, discovered that his mother was missing from her store. There was blood on the floor. The cash register was gone. Frank Worden remembered that Ed Gein had been in the store the day before, and that he had mentioned he planned to return the next morning. Officers went to the Gein farm. What they found there has been described by virtually everyone who was present as something that defied the capacity of language to contain. The farmhouse was a labyrinth of accumulation and decay. In the shed behind the house, Bernice Worden's body was found, decapitated and hung upside down. Inside the house, investigators found human skulls used as bowls, chairs upholstered with human skin, a box of preserved noses, a belt made of female nipples, a wastebasket, a lampshade, a vest, all constructed from human remains, and masks. Human faces, dried and preserved, displayed or stored in paper bags, some of them later identified as having come from exhumed graves. There were 10 female skulls, bones from multiple individuals, a heart found in a paper bag inside a grocery bag near the stove. The documentation of what was found inside that farmhouse is part of the public record. But the point that matters most, the point that separates the black pattern approach from pure true crime cataloging, is this: none of those objects appeared suddenly. None of them were the product of a single night of violence or a sudden break with reality. Every single item in that farmhouse was the endpoint of a process that had been developing for decades, through childhood isolation, through emotional imprisonment, through grief that had nowhere to go and nothing healthy to become, through obsession that grew in silence while the world looked away and assumed that a quiet man on a quiet farm was simply quiet. Ed Gein was arrested on November 16, 1957. He confessed to the murders of Mary Hogan and Bernice Worden. He was found mentally incompetent to stand trial at the initial hearing and was committed to the Central State Hospital for the Criminally Insane. He was later found competent and tried in 1968, found guilty but legally insane, and returned to psychiatric confinement. He died at the Mendota Mental Health Institute on July 26, 1984, from respiratory and heart failure, and was buried in Plainfield, in the same cemetery where he had once dug up the dead. The criminal chapter of Ed Gein's documented life is, in terms of confirmed murders, smaller than many of the killers whose names became more synonymous with serial violence, and yet his cultural impact has been staggering. His story, his farmhouse, the specific texture of his psychology, became the foundational material for some of the most influential horror narratives in the history of cinema. Norman Bates, the character at the center of Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, published as a novel by Robert Bloch in 1959 and filmed in 1960, was explicitly modeled on Ed Gein. The isolated man, the domineering mother, the farmhouse removed from the world, the secret life behind the ordinary face. Bloch, who lived in Wisconsin, was aware of the Gein case when it broke and recognized in it not just a crime story, but a psychological archetype. The man who seems safe until the moment he does not. Leatherface, the central antagonist of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre in 1974, drew from Gein in more visceral ways. The use of human flesh as material, the rural isolation, the family as the container of pathology, the terrifying domesticity of violence. Thomas Harris, writing Hannibal Lecter and later Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs, drew from multiple sources but acknowledged the Gein psychology, particularly the skin suit, the desire for transformation, the obsession with the female form, as central inspiration for Buffalo Bill's character. What these filmmakers and writers recognized was not that Ed Gein had done something spectacular in the conventional sense of serial killer mythology. They recognized that his story contained something more primal and more disturbing than most: the horror of the interior. The horror of what accumulates inside a person when the conditions for psychological health are systematically destroyed, and when no one intervenes, notices, or asks the right questions. And this is where the story of Ed Gein becomes something that reaches beyond one man, in one farmhouse, in one small town in Wisconsin. Because the conditions that shaped him were not unique. The isolation was extreme, but isolation itself is not rare. The dominating, controlling parent who treats a child's emerging self as a threat, that is not rare. The emotional dependency created when a child is denied any other source of connection, that is not rare. The grief that finds no outlet and distorts into obsession, that is not rare. The quiet man that no one thinks to question, that is not rare. What is rare, and what deserves to be understood with clarity rather than sensationalism, is the specific convergence of those factors with a mind already fragile, in conditions where no intervention ever came, where no teacher noticed, where no neighbor asked a meaningful question, where no institution reached inward to the farmhouse on the edge of the field and said, "Something is wrong here. Something is growing that should not be allowed to grow." Ed Gein was not a genius. He was not a monster in any supernatural sense of the word. He was a deeply damaged human being, shaped from birth by forces that robbed him of the capacity to form ordinary human connections, and left alone for decades, while those damaged patterns organized themselves around grief and obsession and the absence of any tether to the ordinary world. The victims of Ed Gein deserve to be remembered as the people they were. Bernice Worden was a mother and a businesswoman. Mary Hogan was a real person with a real life. The women whose graves were violated were people who had loved ones who mourned them and did not understand, for years, why certain things were missing. They were not props in a horror story. They were the human cost of a pattern that was allowed to develop without interruption. What their stories demand, what all the stories on this channel ultimately demand, is not fascination with the criminal, but attention to the conditions that produce such criminals. The warning signs that appear early and are not read. The isolation that is misidentified as harmlessness. The grief that is left without support. The psychology that, left alone and unaddressed, finds its own terrible resolution. When that deputy pushed open the farmhouse door on that November evening and encountered what was inside, he encountered the end of a process. A process that had begun more than half a century earlier, in the mind of a child who was given no other world than the one his mother built for him. That is the most disturbing part of Ed Gein's story. Not what was found in the farmhouse, but how long it took the world to look inside. The monsters we fear most in the end are not the ones that look like monsters. They are the ones who move through the world quietly, in places we never think to look, in patterns we do not recognize until we are standing in a room that has already been closed for years, and the silence in it is absolute.